Hey, by the way, Daniel's a good guy, okay? He's a really good guy. He knows his stuff.
Thank you.
A lot of classic rock stations are now calling grunge classic rock. Does that sit well with you?
I really don't care. I mean, they have a job to do as a radio station, so as the classic rock generation starts to die, which it's happening, as I know classic rock, they have to appeal to yet another audience. So, Nirvana and those bands, they had a lot of good offerings. I'm not saying they were bad bands or anything. It's a lot better than what's out there now. But different kind of music. It's classic in the sense that there were big hits and big bands. So they fit.
Do you think just the sound-wise, just as far as the sound's concerned, do you think that it fits the mold of like the blues-based classic rock, or is it a separate thing? Complicated question, I know.
It is. I would say it's a separate thing. It's sure blues-based, but from an audio dynamics point of view and a chord change point of view and a playing point of view, it's different. And I liked it because it was different. At first I went, oh, what's that? And then I got into it and went, wow, that's not so bad, because those guys could play. And that was the key for me, that a great band with great songs and great players is going to be a great band, without question. So if you look at the Nirvanas and the Pearl Jams and all the Seattle-based bands that came out, those were good bands. There wasn't a bad one among them, in my mind. They were all good bands. It's just a question they were playing a different style of music. Like, you couldn't compare Nirvana or Pearl Jam to Aerosmith or Triumph or any of Bon Jovi or any of the bands of the quote-unquote classic hard rock scene. But they had their own niche. Rock is a very important word in classic rock. Classic in and of itself is just a word to say, okay, if you look in the dictionary, it probably says something that people hold dearly or hold up or something, I don't know. But when you put classic with rock, it means, to me anyway, bands, artists that of their time, they were the best of breed. You could include Nirvana and Pearl Jam because they've kind of paid their dues. They're hitting the point where I think as radio looks at it, every 20 years there's a new set of acts that belong in their format. So, yeah, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, all those bands that made great music, had great songs, played great, they deserve to be there. I would say, classic bands, that were successful, not necessarily superstar successful, but star successful, and with great songs and great musicians, really, that's where I class it as classic rock. So, like we talked about before, if you go back to the late 60s, you had Zeppelin and Purple and Hendrix and all these great artists and playing great music and great performances and great shows and great fans on top of it. And then everybody else followed on from those guys. They were the pioneers. MTV did a lot for a lot of different acts, but the acts really were already big, most of them. And the issue MTV had is nobody made videos, so there wasn't any videos for them to play. We were lucky enough that we had 3 or 4 in the bank that we had made to use for TV commercials. So, we became one of the most played bands on MTV. Peter Gabriel had tons. I know a lot of people say that MTV really killed rock and roll, but it's not true. They actually built rock and roll with the Triumphs of the world, the Bon Jovis, the Guns N' Roses. So they were an integral part of radio, television, press, media, and touring. They just became part of it as they grew, because initially MTV wasn't much. They're on a couple of cable stations, really, and then they managed to get a US-wide distribution. So it's an interesting point, but I was not a big fan of MTV, actually, because, to me, music was theater of the mind. That's like records, everybody drew their own pictures. And once you put a visual to your music, that's not like a live performance, for example, then nobody's thinking on their own. All of a sudden the music, it's there in front of them. So the theater of the mind went away. Music drove the culture. Like the rock stars were the rock stars. They were the image makers. They were the people that people listened to. So the fans would pay attention to what they were doing because everybody lived for rock and roll and music. Now, music's like free and nobody cares. Right? I mean, honestly, that's the case. Once upon a time, music drove 2 generations of people with their beliefs, how they ate, how they dressed, what their lifestyle was like. They go to a show once a week. Now, people go to a show once a year or once every 2 months or once every 6 months, and everybody would buy a new record. They'd line up at the record store to buy it. So there was influence. Music influenced people's lives. Making music is, that was a really fun part, writing and being in the studio. We were kind of lucky because there were only 3 of us. So there wasn't a big political scene going on. Well, I want to do this and you want to do that and, blah, blah, blah. We had a simple democracy, 2 out of 3 wins. And that vote, I lost a lot of votes, Gil lost a lot of votes, Rick lost a lot of votes over the years, but it made you go back and work harder and look harder at your stuff and what you're doing and everybody else's stuff. So Rick would bring a song in and Gil and I go, that's a piece of garbage, Rick. That's just not good enough. And he'd go, oh, I think it's great. Well, give it to us. And we'd rework it a little bit and see if it was acceptable at that point. And we all went through that. And Gil and Rick did most of the writing and I did most of the criticizing. I was the guy that rebuilt the songs, basically.
In your mind, where's the border between heavy metal and hard rock?
I don't, I never really defined that. I mean, if you could call Motorhead heavy metal, right? I mean, there's no question, but Status Quo you could call heavy metal. It's just heard REO Speedwagon is opening for Status Quo in England on the last Status Quo tour, which I had no idea they were touring, but that's going to be an interesting package. I wouldn't want to be REO opening for them. But back to your question, we were all lumped together in the same, from a media point of view, we were always just lumped together as that kind of, well, you're heavy metal or you're hard rock or you're this or you're that. But you were all part of it. The best part of it is we were always referred to as all the bands as a kind of underground, non-starter thing. Meanwhile, everybody's going around selling out arenas and having a great time and selling millions of records. So it's like it wasn't exactly a niche market. For my 2 cents worth, I think the music today can't even compare to the music of the mid 70s to mid 80s. I mean, that was fun. It was rock and roll. It was technique. There were guitar solos on records.
People still believe in the power of rock and roll music.
Hey, thanks for watching. My name is Daniel Sarkissian. I'm an independent filmmaker from Toronto.
I hate that guitar, but I can play that in one scale.
Don't you dare laugh.
I try to embrace the rock and roll spirit in the sense of I do everything self-funded and independently made with no oversight. As such, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for watching.